What if you inherited a mysterious lake house from a grandfather you never knew, only to find out it was promised to someone else? A stubborn, brooding local who won't back down. Secrets will be unearthed, passions will ignite, and lives will change forever. Will Emma uncover the truth or lose everything, including her heart? I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. The day I found out about my inheritance was the day I spilled coffee all over my boss's favorite Italian leather shoes. My inheritance, an old, creaky lake house in the middle of nowhere that I didn't even know existed. And believe me, I would have preferred a shoe replacement fund after the look he gave me. But no, the universe had other plans for me. "You're kidding," I said, reading the letter again as if it would magically change. "This can't be real, right?" But the lawyer on the phone was serious. My grandfather, the man I'd only met once at age 7, had left me a house. His voice droned on about family legacy and personal obligations, and a whole bunch of legalese I tuned out until I heard Pacific Northwest. I'd never pictured myself as the type to own property or inherit things. My family history was mostly defined by people who owed money, not people who handed it out. And yet, here I was, 29 and the proud owner of a lake house I didn't ask for, left to me by a man who'd been practically a ghost. I wasn't exactly sentimental, but something pulled at me. Maybe it was the idea of a place that actually belonged to me. Or maybe it was the fact that my so-called family had a whole house tucked away in the woods without telling me. 2 days later, I was on a rickety bus that should have been retired years ago, watching pines flash past the window. I finally reached my destination, Greenwood Lake, Washington, a small town where everyone knew everyone and no one knew me. The house sat on the edge of the lake, tucked between towering pines and a shoreline dotted with smooth stones. The water looked like glass, reflecting the sun in a way that made it seem like something out of a dream. And the house, well, it was better than I'd imagined. 3 stories, weathered but charming, with a wraparound porch and tall windows framed by moss-covered stone. The place looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for someone to exhale and bring it back to life. And somehow, it was mine. I stood on the porch, inhaling the earthy smell of pine and lake water, thinking that maybe, just maybe, this could work. That was, until I noticed someone watching me from the edge of the yard. A guy stood there, arms crossed, giving me a look like I'd just insulted his dog. "Hey!" I called, taking a step forward. "Can I help you?" He didn't move. More like the other way around. I narrowed my eyes, trying to make him out. Tall, broad-shouldered, maybe early 30s. His dark hair was mussed, his face half hidden under the shadow of a baseball cap. He looked like someone who'd be more comfortable splitting wood than making small talk. A typical small-town guy, maybe. One who probably knew 100 ways to fix up a lake house. Can I help you with..." "What, exactly?" I asked. He sighed, like he'd been hoping I'd figure it out. "That house you're standing in front of? It was supposed to be mine." There it was. That pang of skepticism. My big city mind immediately flashed to a dozen articles about property scams, identity theft, and horror stories where people moved into inherited houses only to find they weren't alone. Right. And who are you exactly? Luke Carter. He said it with a confidence that made it sound like he expected me to recognize the name. And that house should have been left to me. I blinked, both irritated and intrigued. "Well, Luke Carter, as you can see, the house was left to me. Emma Brooks." He frowned. "You're Frank's granddaughter?" I hesitated. Technically, yes, but it felt weird claiming any real connection to the man. "I mean, I guess so." Luke looked at me like I'd just told him I had a pet dragon. "You guess so?" Look, I barely knew the guy. He was practically a stranger. He shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and something else I couldn't quite place. "Figures. Frank would leave this place to someone who didn't care." I opened my mouth to argue, but he'd already turned and started walking away, muttering something under his breath. "Hey!" I called, more out of irritation than anything else. "I didn't ask for this, you know. I just showed up because a lawyer told me this place was mine." He turned, his jaw tight. "Yeah, well, just because you own something doesn't mean you deserve it." And with that, he was gone, leaving me fuming on the porch of a house I'd known for all of 5 minutes. I watched him disappear into the trees, his silhouette fading among the pines, leaving an almost surreal sense of emptiness behind. Once I got inside, The house wasn't as grand as it looked from the outside. There was dust everywhere, and a faint smell of something stale, like the ghosts of old furniture or memories best left undisturbed. But it was beautiful in its own neglected way. Antique furniture, bookshelves packed with worn-out volumes, and a massive stone fireplace that looked like it had hosted some epic fires in its day. I wandered from room to room, each one revealing more of my grandfather's life than I'd ever known. Framed photos of people I didn't recognize, postcards from places he'd visited, a wooden box on the mantel that held an assortment of random items. It felt like he'd left me a time capsule of his life, a puzzle I wasn't sure I was ready to solve. As I moved through the house, I kept thinking of Luke and his words. Just because you own something doesn't mean you deserve it. He'd said it with such conviction, like he'd spent his whole life waiting for this place. And I couldn't help but wonder, what made him so certain he was the rightful owner? What was his connection to my grandfather? And more importantly, where did that leave me? By dusk, the lake house was bathed in a soft golden light. I sat on the porch, staring out at the water, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of peace, a hint of what my grandfather might have loved about this place. But that calm didn't last long. Just as I was about to head inside, I heard footsteps. Turning, I saw Luke again, his figure cutting through the twilight like he belonged to the landscape. "Did you need something?" I asked, trying to sound casual. I'd hoped for a quiet evening to figure things out, but apparently, he had other plans. "Just wanted to make one thing clear," he said, stopping at the edge of the porch. "That house meant something to your grandfather. It meant something to me. So if you're thinking of selling it off like some abandoned property, you might want to think twice." "Wow," I said, crossing my arms. "First you tell me I don't deserve it, now you're telling me what to do with it?" Luke didn't flinch. "I'm just saying, some things are worth more than money. Maybe one day you'll understand that." With that, he walked off, leaving me alone with 100 questions, and a lake house that suddenly felt a lot more complicated. The next morning, I woke to the sound of someone hammering. Hard. I bolted out of bed, still half dreaming about lakes and forest creatures, and peered out the window. Sure enough, there was Luke Carter, hammering a "no trespassing" sign into the ground. On my property. This guy had nerve. I grabbed a sweatshirt, stuffed my feet into my boots, and marched outside. He glanced up when he heard me coming, but kept hammering, cool as anything. "Excuse me," I called, standing a few paces away, hands on my hips. He didn't stop. "Morning, sunshine." "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded. "Securing the property," he said, finally stepping back and admiring his work. The bold letters stood out, almost taunting me. "No trespassing." Trespassing on my own property, apparently. I stared at him, exasperated. "Luke, I told you yesterday, the house belongs to me." The lawyer confirmed it. "And I told you," he said, crossing his arms. "Your grandfather promised me this land. We had a deal." My stomach churned, part frustration, part curiosity. "What kind of deal?" He took a deep breath, his gaze shifting from me to the lake. "Your grandfather, Frank. He wasn't exactly the family man, was he?" I let out a laugh, a short, sharp sound. "You could say that. He was like Bigfoot, someone people talked about but never actually saw." Luke smirked, then looked serious again. "Well, he was different with me. I spent a lot of time here, helping him with the house, fishing with him, fixing things up. He told me this place would be mine one day." There was a sadness in his voice I hadn't expected, a weight that hinted at years of attachment. For a second, I felt a pang of guilt, like I was the one intruding. "Look, I get that this house means a lot to you," I said, trying to sound diplomatic. "But it was left to me. I didn't even know about any of this until 2 days ago." Luke's jaw clenched. "Figures. Just like Frank, always leaving people in the dark." I bristled. "If you're trying to make me feel sorry for you, it's not working." He let out a bitter laugh. "You think I want sympathy from you? I want what I was promised." The air was thick with tension, and we stared each other down, neither of us willing to back down. Part of me wanted to grab that sign and toss it into the lake. But another part, the part that still had no idea why my grandfather had left this house to me, felt more conflicted than I wanted to admit. "Fine," I said finally, my voice low. "You don't believe me? Then let's go through the house together. Maybe you can help me find something that explains why he left it to me." Luke's eyebrows shot up. "You want my help?" I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "I mean, If you really think you had some right to this place, don't you want answers too? For a moment, he looked like he was going to turn me down flat. But then he nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching with something that looked suspiciously like respect. All right, but I'm only doing this to prove a point. Fine by me, I replied, trying to ignore the flicker of excitement in my chest. The house felt different with Luke inside. He moved like he knew the place, stepping over the loose floorboard in the living room and heading straight for the kitchen without so much as a second glance at the faded wallpaper or the cluttered bookshelves. Watching him, I realized he really had spent a lot of time here, probably more than I ever would have. We combed through room after room, checking drawers, cabinets, even the dusty attic, but there was nothing. No letter, no will, no clue as to why my grandfather would have left this place to me instead of Luke. In the study, Luke stopped in front of an old, faded photograph on the wall. It showed my grandfather, much younger, standing with a woman I didn't recognize. They were smiling, looking happy. I'd never seen a picture of him like that. "That's Frank and Rose," Luke said quietly, his tone almost reverent. "Who?" "His wife. Your grandmother. They were married before she passed away. Frank never really got over it." I stared at the picture, a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar hitting me. All my life, my grandfather had been a myth, a story my parents used as an excuse for every bad family trait. I'd never even known he'd been married. "So, what, he spent all these years alone up here?" I asked, feeling strangely vulnerable. Luke nodded. "Pretty much. I think that's why he took me under his wing." I reminded him of her, in a way. He hesitated, then added, "She had this way of making everything feel like home." I glanced at him, half expecting to see a smirk, but his face was serious, his eyes soft with a mix of nostalgia and sadness. Suddenly, I felt out of place, like I was trespassing not just on Luke's territory, but on a piece of family history I'd never known existed. I turned away, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that maybe he was right, that maybe I didn't deserve this place. After another hour of searching, Luke finally sighed and crossed his arms, looking as frustrated as I felt. Nothing. Not a single thing that explains why he'd leave this place to a stranger. I shot him a look. "I'm not a stranger. I'm his granddaughter." "Funny," he replied, his voice cool. "You don't seem to know much about him." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words stuck in my throat. Because he was right. I didn't know anything about my grandfather or this house, or why he'd left it to me. All I knew was that it felt like a burden I wasn't sure I could carry. After a moment, Luke shook his head, his expression softening. "Look, I get that this isn't easy for you either, but this house, it's not just a piece of property. It's part of something bigger." "Bigger?" I echoed, curious in spite of myself. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "You think this place is yours now, but Greenwood Lake, this house, has its own story, and it's up to you to decide if you're part of it." The weight of his words settled over me, leaving me speechless. He gave me one last look, then turned and headed for the door, leaving me standing alone in the quiet house, his words echoing in my mind. I hadn't thought about what it would mean to settle into an old house, especially not one in the middle of nowhere, Washington. You'd think that at some point I'd have stopped finding ways to trip over my own feet, but there I was, tripping over another one of my grandfather's trinkets in the cluttered hallway. If the place wasn't haunted, it was at least trying its best to send me running. Luke's words from the day before wouldn't leave my mind. Greenwood Lake, this house, has its own story. For some reason, it felt like a dare. So I spent the morning exploring the house's nooks and crannies, trying to see if maybe it would spill a few secrets for me. The living room alone was a treasure trove of bizarre knickknacks. There were dusty fishing rods stacked in one corner, ancient maps pinned to the wall, and an entire shelf of mystery novels, all worn from use. It was strange, like my grandfather had lived two lives. One of them closed off to me. I was halfway through examining an old compass, which, to my disappointment, didn't lead to any hidden treasure, when I heard footsteps on the porch. I froze, my heart doing a little tap dance. No one else was supposed to be here. Well, unless... Sure enough, a second later, Luke's voice cut through the quiet like he owned the place. "Emma, you in here?" "Maybe," I called back, hoping I sounded a lot cooler than I felt. He walked in, brushing off pine needles from his flannel shirt, and took one look at the mess I'd made of the living room. "You redecorating?" "I was investigating," I said, like that made it any better. Trying to figure out what this house was all about. You know, for the sake of legacy or whatever. A hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Find anything interesting?" I shrugged, feeling a little silly. A broken compass, a lot of fishing gear, some questionable-smelling jackets. I glanced around at the chaos. "Basically, it's just a pile of stuff." Luke picked up an old fishing lure, running his thumb over it with the kind of reverence I hadn't expected. "This isn't just stuff," he said quietly. "It's your grandfather's life." I watched him, something softening in me as he held that lure like it was a piece of gold. "You really cared about him, didn't you?" He nodded, not looking up. "Frank was complicated. He didn't talk about his past much, and he didn't always let people get close. But he was good to me. When no one else bothered, he taught me things. Fishing, how to fix things. He trusted me." The way he spoke made me feel like an intruder again, and the question I'd been avoiding pressed at the back of my mind. Why had my grandfather left the house to me instead of to him? Luke's voice pulled me back. "I think he left all this stuff for a reason. Maybe he wanted you to understand him, even if he wasn't around to tell you himself." I didn't have an answer for that, so I turned back to the bookshelf. My fingers trailed over the spines of old novels, a mix of mysteries and thrillers, the kind you'd read in an old armchair by the fire. Did he ever mention my mom? Or why he stayed away from us? Luke was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was low. He'd say your mom didn't want anything to do with him, that she felt he'd let her down when she needed him the most. He never told me exactly what happened, though. I felt a pang, wondering if maybe I'd inherited that stubborn streak from my mother, or maybe even from him. I'd never considered how family histories can be their own kind of inheritance. As the afternoon wore on, Luke stayed, helping me sift through more of the house's contents. He knew the place better than I did, opening cabinets and drawers with a casual ease that told me he'd done this 100 times before. At one point, I found a box of faded letters tucked behind a stack of novels. The paper was thin and yellowed, the handwriting scrawled and hurried. They were all addressed to my grandfather, from my grandmother, Rose. Each letter was short, with lines like, "The lake isn't the same without you," or "I miss you every day." I read them in silence, each word filling in tiny pieces of a picture I'd never known. Luke watched me, his expression unreadable. She loved him, you know, Rose. Even after she was gone, he always kept her memory close. A lump formed in my throat. I wasn't sure what I was looking for in those letters. Maybe some proof that I was part of this family, that my roots went deeper than a legal document. Luke seemed to sense my thoughts. Families are complicated. Just because Frank kept his distance doesn't mean he didn't care. Maybe he just didn't know how to show it. I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I just nodded, still holding the letters like they'd slip through my fingers if I wasn't careful. There was a tenderness in Luke's voice that made me think he knew exactly what it felt like to be cut off, to hold on to the past even when it felt like it was slipping away. The afternoon sun was starting to sink lower when we finally called it quits on our investigation. Luke helped me pile the books back onto the shelves, though he took his time flipping through a few of them, as if they held secrets he'd missed the first time around. By the time we were done, the room looked almost the same as when we'd started, but everything felt different. As he headed to the door, Luke paused, glancing back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You planning on sticking around?" he asked, like it was a casual question. I thought about it, looking around at the house and all the history it held. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to run back to the city, but part of me feels like I'm supposed to stay." Luke nodded, his eyes softening. "Maybe that's why Frank left it to you. Maybe he thought you needed this place as much as it needed you." Before I could respond, he was gone, leaving me alone in the house that was starting to feel a little less haunted and a little more like home. That night, I lay awake in the unfamiliar silence, the only sounds the occasional hoot of an owl and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. I thought about Luke's words, about the letters, and about the strange, magnetic pull this house had on me. It was more than just a building. It was a piece of family history, a fragment of a past I'd never known, but was suddenly desperate to understand. And as much as I wanted to pretend otherwise, I knew I wasn't ready to leave just yet. The morning fog on Greenwood Lake was so thick it felt like I could reach out and pull it around me like a blanket. It was beautiful in a way that made me want to just sit on the porch and watch the mist dance over the water. But this morning, I wasn't alone. Luke showed up just as I was finishing my coffee, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. He looked more relaxed than usual, like he'd made peace with my presence, at least for the moment. "Figured I'd take you out on the lake today," he said, his tone casual. "Take me out on the lake?" I repeated, a little caught off guard. "Yeah." He gave a small shrug, looking everywhere but directly at me. "If you're planning to stay, you might as well get to know it. Frank always said you couldn't know Greenwood until you'd seen it from the water." His offer surprised me, but I wasn't about to turn it down. "All right," I said, trying to sound as nonchalant as he did. "Lead the way." Luke's boat was an old, sturdy thing, clearly well cared for, with a faded wooden finish that made it look as much a part of the lake as the trees on the shore. He helped me in, and we pushed off, the quiet hum of the motor blending with the sound of the water lapping against the hull. We drifted through the fog, the world around us softened by mist. Greenwood Lake felt endless out there, stretching out in all directions, its secrets hidden beneath a smooth, glassy surface. "This lake is kind of incredible," I murmured, almost to myself. "Yeah." Luke's voice was low, thoughtful. "There's nothing like it. Frank always said Greenwood had its own way of keeping secrets." He glanced at me. Guess he was right. We fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that made me feel more at ease with him than I'd felt with anyone in a long time. I looked out over the water, feeling a strange kind of peace settle over me. "Can I ask you something?" Luke's voice broke the quiet. "Sure," I said, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "What are you doing here?" He kept his gaze on the water. "I mean, really, why'd you come?" I hesitated, thinking of how to put it into words. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe I just wanted to see if there was anything here worth knowing. A part of me thought I'd find answers, I guess." "Answers?" He looked over, curious. "My family," I said, struggling to keep my tone light. "They've always been this mystery. And my grandfather? He was like this phantom in the background. I figured this place might help me understand why." Luke nodded, thoughtful. Frank wasn't the easiest guy to figure out. He kept his cards close, even with people he cared about. He paused, glancing at me. But he was a good man. He had his reasons for staying away. "And you?" I asked, surprising myself. "What keeps you here?" Luke's expression softened. "This lake is home. It's where I grew up, where I learned everything I know. Frank took me in when I had no one else. Showed me how to fish, how to fix things, how to make sense of the world." He looked down, his fingers tracing patterns on the edge of the boat. "When he told me he'd leave the house to me someday, I guess I thought I'd found my place." I swallowed, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I didn't know." He looked at me, his gaze steady. "It's not your fault. But this place, it's more than just a house to me." We drifted in silence for a while, the fog lifting slowly, revealing the edges of the shore. I watched the trees come into view, tall and proud, their roots buried deep in the earth. Greenwood wasn't just a lake. It was an anchor, grounding everyone who belonged to it. Luke turned the boat toward the far shore, guiding us into a small cove hidden among the trees. As we pulled up, I noticed a stone structure, an old, weathered dock, partially hidden by moss and ivy. It looked like it had been there forever. "This was Frank's favorite spot," Luke said, gesturing to the dock. "He'd come out here to think. Said it reminded him of better times." I stepped onto the dock, feeling the rough stone under my boots, and looked out at the lake. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and a faint breeze stirred the water, sending ripples across its surface. "This place," I said softly, letting the words trail off. It was beautiful in a haunting, timeless way, like a piece of a world I'd never known but felt a strange connection to. Luke joined me, standing close enough that I could feel his warmth. He said this was where he asked Rose to marry him. I glanced at him, surprised. "My grandmother?" He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "They were sitting right here, watching the sunset. Frank said he'd never seen anything more beautiful than that moment." He looked out at the water. "Guess he wanted you to know what he saw that day." A lump formed in my throat, and I turned back to the lake, trying to process the emotions swirling inside me. I'd spent my whole life feeling disconnected from my family, like I was just a stray branch on a forgotten family tree. But here, in this quiet, hidden spot, I felt like I'd found a root, one that connected me to something bigger. We stood there in silence, the world around us calm and still, and for the first time, I felt like I could almost understand why my grandfather had left me this place. He'd wanted me to see what he'd seen, to feel what he'd felt. After a while, Luke broke the silence. You know, for what it's worth, I think Frank left you this house for a reason. I looked at him, his face softened by the golden light filtering through the trees. You really think so? He nodded. Yeah, I think he knew you needed a place to belong, somewhere that could feel like home. I swallowed, my heart tightening in a way that made it hard to speak. Thanks, Luke. I appreciate that. He gave a small smile, his gaze holding mine a moment longer than I'd expected. Anytime. We stood there for a few more minutes, watching the light fade over the water, each of us lost in our own thoughts. And as we headed back to the lake house, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I was starting to find the answers I'd been searching for. I never thought I'd spend a sunny Saturday morning scrubbing decades-old grime from the windows of a lake house with a guy who'd been trying to claim my inheritance just a few days earlier. But that's exactly where I found myself, kneeling beside Luke, our arms brushing as we scrubbed side by side, windows open to let in the cool, pine-scented breeze. As we worked, Luke told me stories about my grandfather, how he'd take his old fishing boat out at dawn, cursing the fish and muttering that they had it out for him, or how he once chased a raccoon around the porch with a broom after it stole his lunch. It was the first time anyone had made my grandfather sound like a real person, and I felt a strange sense of gratitude. It was like Luke was filling in the blanks in my family history, one story at a time. You know, Luke said, standing back to admire our work. These windows actually let in a decent amount of light now. Feels like a whole new place. Funny, I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead. You never struck me as the type to care about natural lighting. He smirked. I can appreciate a good view. I rolled my eyes, but a small smile tugged at my lips. Despite our rough start, I was starting to like having him around. There was something grounding about him, a calm steadiness that made the house feel, well, less haunted. But as the day wore on, our differences started to resurface. We were in the middle of moving some of the old furniture out of the living room when Luke looked around, frowning. So, what are you planning to do with this place? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. I hesitated, feeling the familiar twist of uncertainty in my gut. Honestly, I don't know. Part of me thinks I should sell it. It's too much to keep up with, and I already have a life back in the city. Luke's expression tightened, and he set down the chair he'd been carrying with a little more force than necessary. Sell it? I shrugged, trying to sound casual. Why not? It's not like I have any deep connection to this place. His jaw clenched. So you just get rid of it? After everything? I looked at him, thrown off by the sudden intensity in his eyes. Luke, it's not personal. It's just practical. His eyes flashed and he let out a bitter laugh. Practical? Of course. I should have known you'd see it that way. My patience snapped. What is that supposed to mean? He met my gaze, his expression stormy. It means you don't get it, Emma. You're standing in a house filled with history, with pieces of your family's past, and all you can think about is how to get rid of it. That's not fair, I shot back, my voice rising. I didn't ask for this house. I didn't ask for any of this. I came here because I wanted to understand, to find some connection to a family I barely know. But I'm not just going to throw away my life because of some house. Some house, he repeated, his voice low. This isn't just some house. It was your grandfather's legacy. It was promised to me. And now, after everything, you're just going to turn around and sell it? I opened my mouth to argue, but the words got tangled up with something else. Guilt, anger, and a hurt I hadn't been ready to face. Why do you care so much? I demanded. Why can't you just let it go? He looked at me, and for a split second, I saw a flash of something raw and vulnerable in his eyes. Because this place was the closest thing I ever had to a home. Because your grandfather gave me hope when I had none. And now you're here, acting like it doesn't mean anything. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't thought about it that way. How deeply this place must have meant to him. I took a shaky breath, struggling to keep my voice steady. I didn't know, Luke. I didn't understand. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long breath. Maybe that's the problem. You say you want answers, but you're too focused on the past to see what's right in front of you. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over us like a heavy blanket. I felt my cheeks flush, a strange mixture of shame and defiance churning in my chest. Part of me wanted to argue, to defend my choices, but another part, the part that was slowly starting to feel connected to this house, to my grandfather, and maybe even to Luke, knew he was right. Look, I said finally, my voice soft. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but maybe I'll stick around a little longer, just to see if there's something here worth staying for. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, I thought he might reach out, might say something that would bridge the gap between us. But instead, he just nodded, his eyes shadowed with a sadness I couldn't quite place. Do what you want, Emma, he said, his voice low. Just think about what this place means to the people who care about it. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving me standing alone in the living room, surrounded by echoes of a past I was only beginning to understand. I spent most of the next day wrestling with Luke's words, the things he'd said replaying in my mind like a broken record. This house wasn't just some old property to him. It was home, history, everything he'd wanted but never had. And here I was, still on the fence, half in and half out, trying to decide whether to stay or go. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. Maybe there was something I'd missed in my grandfather's study, hidden among the books and trinkets. I went in and started rifling through the shelves, flipping through old books and maps, hoping to find some sign, something that would make everything clear. I was just about to give up when I noticed a thin, leather-bound journal wedged behind a stack of mystery novels. The cover was worn and cracked, and as I pulled it out, a small envelope slipped from between the pages, fluttering to the floor. The envelope had my name on it, Emma, written in a slanted, old-fashioned script that sent a shiver down my spine. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, just staring at the letters. This was it. An answer, a connection to the man who'd left me this house without so much as a goodbye. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. Dear Emma, I imagine by the time you find this, I'll be gone. You might be wondering why I left this place to you, why I reached out in this strange, roundabout way instead of talking to you in person. I don't blame you if you're angry. I never found the courage to be the kind of grandfather you needed, and for that, I'm truly sorry. This house, Greenwood, has been in our family for generations. Your grandmother, Rose, loved it here. She always said the lake had a way of mending broken things. I don't know if that's true, but I hope it's something you'll come to understand for yourself. I left this house to you because I wanted you to have a place where you could feel grounded, a place where you could belong. I know your life is elsewhere, and I don't expect you to stay here forever. But if you ever find yourself feeling lost, come back to Greenwood. Let it be a reminder that no matter how far you go, you'll always have roots here. A piece of family that's yours and yours alone. With love, Grandpa Frank. The words blurred as I read them, my eyes stinging with the beginnings of tears. My grandfather's voice was gentle, regretful, filled with the kind of honesty that seemed both too little and too late. He had wanted me to feel connected, wanted me to know that I belonged somewhere. But why now? Why leave it all to me when he'd barely been a part of my life? I sat there, holding the letter like it might disappear, a strange mix of anger and sadness swirling in my chest. He'd given me a legacy I hadn't asked for, a connection to a past that felt both comforting and impossibly distant. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or resentful, or maybe a little bit of both. I was still sitting there when I heard a knock on the door. I quickly wiped my eyes, trying to pull myself together before Luke saw me looking like a mess. Hey, he said, stepping into the study, his gaze flicking to the letter in my hand. You okay? I managed a shaky smile. I found something. He didn't ask. He just waited, letting me collect my thoughts. Finally, I handed him the letter, my hands still trembling a little. He read it in silence, his expression softening as he took in my grandfather's words. When he finished, he looked at me, his eyes full of a compassion that felt almost too intense. He cared about you, he said quietly, in his own way. Maybe he just didn't know how to show it. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. It's like he left me this whole world, a world he never let me be a part of when he was alive. I don't know what to do with that. Luke was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sometimes, people have their reasons. Doesn't make it right, but maybe it's the only way they know how to protect the things they love." The words hit me harder than I expected, and I glanced away, feeling the ache of years of missed connections, missed chances. "I keep wondering why he chose me," I admitted. "I don't even know if I deserve it." Luke's hand found mine, warm and steady, grounding me. "Maybe he knew you'd be the one to understand. Maybe he saw something in you, even if he didn't say it out loud." I looked up at him, our faces close enough that I could see every detail. The flecks of gold in his eyes, the faint scar along his jaw, the way his gaze softened when he looked at me. And in that moment, the anger, the confusion, the sadness, it all faded, leaving only the quiet, steady pulse of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Before I could think twice, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our lips met, hesitant at first, then deeper, like we'd been holding back too much for too long. His hand slid to my cheek, and I felt a shiver run through me as he pulled me closer, every doubt and hesitation dissolving in the warmth of his touch. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless, my heart racing, my head spinning. "Sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. He smiled, his thumb brushing my cheek. "Don't be." We sat there in the fading light, his hand still resting in mine, neither of us needing to fill the silence. It was like something had shifted between us, like the lake house itself had brought us together, weaving our stories into the walls, the floors, the very air around us. And as I looked around the study, the letter still in my hand, I knew that this place held more than just memories. It was a legacy, a part of my grandfather, a part of Luke, a part of me. Maybe this house had been waiting for me after all. I woke up the next morning with a strange mix of clarity and nerves. The letter had changed everything. My grandfather's words had cracked open a door I'd been keeping shut for years, and as much as I wanted to keep things simple, I knew there was no going back. Not now. Luke showed up at the lake house mid-morning, his usual quiet confidence softened by a hint of something I couldn't quite read. When he saw me standing on the porch, waiting, he paused, hands in his pockets, his gaze steady, but cautious. "Morning," he said, nodding as he stepped up to the porch. "Morning," I replied, feeling my cheeks flush at the memory of last night. We didn't talk about the kiss. Instead, we just looked at each other, like we were both waiting for the other to say something. But words felt clumsy in the clear morning light, and part of me wanted to keep that moment tucked away, safe and untouched. Finally, I took a breath, deciding it was time to address the question we'd both been dancing around. "Luke, we need to talk about the house." His expression shifted, his jaw tightening just a bit. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine, waiting. I felt my heart pound as I searched for the right words. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but I'm starting to understand why my grandfather left it to me. He wanted this place to be something more than just a piece of property. It was his way of giving me a home, even if he wasn't around to see it. Luke's gaze softened, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "He wanted you to have a place to come back to." I nodded. "Exactly. And I think I want to honor that. I want to make this place mean something. Maybe even make it a part of my life in some way." A flicker of hope crossed his face, but he stayed quiet, waiting for me to continue. I took a deep breath. "But I can't do it alone. I don't have the skills or the resources or, well, honestly, the history with this place that you do." I looked up at him, feeling vulnerable and hopeful all at once. "I want you to help me, not just with fixing it up, but with making it feel like home, for both of us." He blinked, clearly caught off guard. You want me to stay?" I nodded, feeling a strange rush of relief. "Yeah, I know this place means as much to you as it does to me, maybe even more. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that Greenwood isn't just a house. It's a piece of our lives, our families. It belongs to both of us." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze searching mine, and then a slow smile spread across his face. "You really mean that?" I nodded, feeling a surge of warmth at his expression. "I do. This place wouldn't be the same without you, and I wouldn't feel the same about it, either." He looked down, clearly struggling with his own emotions. When he finally looked back up, his eyes were bright, filled with a quiet joy that took my breath away. You have no idea how much this means to me, Emma. I felt my heart swell, and before I knew it, I was reaching for his hand, lacing my fingers through his. Then let's do this. Together. He squeezed my hand, his smile widening. I'm all in. We spent the rest of the day planning out what it would take to restore the house. Luke knew every inch of the property, pointing out areas that needed work, repairs we'd have to make, and little details that would help preserve the charm of the place. I found myself getting caught up in his excitement, my mind racing with possibilities. By sunset, we were sitting on the porch, exhausted but happy, watching the lake shimmer in the fading light. It was the first time in years I felt like I had something solid to hold on to, a future that felt both scary and exhilarating. As we sat in silence, Luke glanced over at me, his eyes thoughtful. You know, I always thought I'd be fixing this place up alone. I never imagined, well, this. I laughed softly, leaning back against the porch railing. You and me both. But I guess sometimes life has a way of surprising us. He chuckled, looking out over the lake. Guess so. He paused, then added quietly, I don't know what I'd do without this place. Or without you. The words took me by surprise, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in a long time. I looked over at him, the soft glow of the sunset casting warm shadows across his face. Luke, I don't think I could do this without you either. We sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past few days melting away as we watched the lake together. And as the stars began to peek through the twilight sky, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that, somehow, we were exactly where we were meant to be. For the first time since I'd arrived, Greenwood didn't feel like a mystery to solve or a burden to carry. It felt like home. The sound of hammering and laughter filled the air as Luke and I worked side by side on the lake house. We'd been at it for hours, but the tiredness felt more like satisfaction than exhaustion. Each swing of the hammer, each brush of paint, every small repair was like building a life we'd started imagining together on that porch. It was a strange, beautiful feeling. Having someone here, someone to share the weight of this place, and all it meant. I'd always thought of my life in terms of independence, a constant drive to prove I didn't need anyone. But here with Luke, it was different. It felt like I was part of something bigger, a story that started long before me and would continue long after. We'd decided to turn the lake house into a retreat, a place where people could come to disconnect from the outside world, just like my grandfather had done. It was Luke's idea, really, but as soon as he'd said it, I knew it was right. Greenwood would stay as it was, a piece of family history preserved and shared with others, a place that could bring people together the way it had brought us together. As we wrapped up for the day, I took a step back, admiring our work. The lake house looked brighter, as if it had been holding its breath all these years, and was finally ready to exhale. It's amazing, I murmured, half to myself. I almost don't recognize it. Luke came up beside me, his eyes scanning the house with a quiet pride. It feels different, doesn't it? I nodded. Yeah, like it's finally come back to life. He looked down at me, his gaze warm and steady. That's because it has. You brought it back, Emma. We both did. I felt a lump in my throat, a mixture of happiness and nostalgia for the journey we'd been on. The house was beautiful, but it was more than that. It was a testament to everything we'd built together, every choice that had led us here. What do you think Frank would say if he saw this? I asked softly. Luke's face softened, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I think he'd be proud, and I think he'd be glad it's finally being shared with people who'll appreciate it. I nodded, my heart swelling with a quiet contentment. My grandfather's letter had asked me to understand his love for this place, and I finally did. He'd left me Greenwood because he'd known, deep down, that it would mean something to me too, that it would give me the sense of belonging I'd been searching for. We watched the sun set in silence, the lake turning shades of pink and gold as the sky darkened. It felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. A new chapter, one I was more than ready to step into. Come on, Luke said, taking my hand. Let's go down to the dock, one last time before we finish up. We walked down to the water's edge, hand in hand, the world around us quiet and still. The lake was calm, reflecting the last of the sunset like a mirror. And as we stood on the old stone dock, I felt the weight of everything we'd built settling into place. Luke turned to me, his expression gentle, his hand warm and steady in mine. I know this started out as something we were both just fighting for, he said, his voice low. "But it's become more than that. You've become more than that." I looked up at him, my heart pounding as his words sank in. "Luke." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. "I love you, Emma. I don't know how else to say it. This place, it was always a part of me. But now, so are you." The words filled me with a warmth I couldn't put into words. All I knew was that I'd finally found something I wanted to hold on to. Someone I wanted to stay beside, through every change and challenge that lay ahead. "I love you too, Luke," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "This place, it's part of me now because of you, because of us." He pulled me close, and I wrapped my arms around him, feeling a sense of peace settle over me that I'd never known before. In that moment, it didn't matter what the future held or where life would take us. Greenwood was ours, a part of our story, a place we'd share and care for together. As the stars appeared over the lake, we stood there, wrapped in each other's warmth, feeling the gentle pull of something timeless and true. Greenwood was no longer just a house. It was a home, a legacy we'd carry forward, one story at a time. And with Luke beside me, I knew that for the first time, I'd finally found my place. 1 year later, Greenwood Lake was buzzing with life in a way it hadn't been in years. The once silent lake house now had a hum of its own, with voices and laughter filling the air as friends, family, and guests arrived for the weekend. Luke and I had transformed it, little by little, into a peaceful retreat for those looking to unplug and recharge. The lake house had become a haven, not just for us, but for everyone who walked through its doors. As I stood on the porch, watching a group of visitors chatting by the water, I felt a surge of pride. Greenwood wasn't just my grandfather's legacy anymore. It had become ours, a place shaped by every story, every memory, every small act of love that Luke and I had poured into it. Luke came up beside me, slipping his arm around my waist, his gaze sweeping over the lake with a look of quiet satisfaction. "Looks good, doesn't it?" he said, smiling as he watched the guests settling in, some gathering around the fire pit, others exploring the trails along the shore. "It does," I murmured, leaning into him. "Better than I ever imagined." He chuckled, pressing a kiss to my temple. "I'd say we make a pretty good team." I laughed, remembering all the days we'd spent fixing up the house, the nights we'd fallen asleep exhausted but happy, knowing we were building something lasting together. "I think so too," I said, squeezing his hand. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." We stood there in comfortable silence, watching the lake sparkle under the afternoon sun. Greenwood had transformed from an empty, forgotten place into a home, a place filled with life and love, a place that gave back as much as it received. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water, Luke turned to me, his eyes soft. "Your grandfather would be proud, you know." A lump formed in my throat, but I smiled, feeling a warmth that went deeper than words. "I think he would. I think this is exactly what he wanted." Luke nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "He wanted you to have something to come back to, a place that felt like it was yours." I looked out at the lake, my heart swelling with gratitude and a sense of peace I'd never known before. Greenwood was more than just a house, more than just an inheritance. It was a reminder of the roots that had been waiting for me all along, a connection that ran deeper than I'd ever realized. As the last of the guests settled around the fire pit, Luke and I made our way down to join them, our hands intertwined. We sat with our friends and neighbors, sharing stories, laughter, and memories under the stars. And as the fire crackled and the lake shimmered in the moonlight, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me, a knowing that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Greenwood Lake had given me more than just a home. It had given me a family, a sense of belonging, and a love that felt as enduring as the lake itself. And I knew, deep in my heart, that it was a legacy I would cherish and carry forward, one story at a time. The lake house would live on, not just in its walls or its history, but in the lives it touched, the memories it held, and the love that bound it all together. And as I looked over at Luke, his face lit by the glow of the fire, I felt a peace that went beyond words, a joy that filled every corner of my heart. For the first time, I knew that Greenwood wasn't just a part of my past. It was my future, my home, and my heart. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. Jade Monroe, A struggling artist who just inherited $75 million from a man she barely knew. But to claim it, she has to get married in 1 year. No big deal, right? Wrong. Because her lawyer, the charming but cold Ethan Caldwell, has just made her an offer she never saw coming.